Hello and welcome. My name is Rachel Kane and I am presenting my Honors Capstone Defense. During my senior year at Black Hills State University, I created a project to examine the effects that adverse childhood experiences have on romantic relationships in adulthood. I am so thrilled to be able to share the results of my project with you today. So what exactly are adverse childhood experiences? The CDC has defined adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, as notable, potentially traumatic events individuals can be exposed to sometime between birth and the age of 18. When we think of trauma, we often imagine the worst forms of physical harm that people can experience. However, that's not always the case. Trauma can include things such as physical abuse, yes, but it can also include divorce, substance abuse, and mental illness. ACEs cover a wide scale of trauma. So why does it matter? There is extensive research out there that documents the impact of childhood trauma. Unfortunately, it doesn't just magically go away the day you turn 18 and become an adult. The impacts of trauma in childhood are long-lasting and affect many areas of functioning. Increased exposure to childhood traumas multiplies the risk for several severe causes of death in adults. These include placing individuals at an increased risk for a variety of diseases such as cancer, chronic lung disease, and heart disease. It also increases the risk for skeletal fractures, obesity, and even early mortality. And those are just the physical implications. There are mental health implications as well, such as increased risk for depression and anxiety and mental illnesses in general, poor emotion regulation, and suicidality. Finally, there are even behavioral influences that occur as a result of childhood trauma. Individuals who have experienced more ACEs are more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, smoke, have a higher number of sexual partners, and have a greater chance of being exposed to sexually transmitted diseases. The impacts of ACEs on adult health are clear and apparent. When the original ACE study was conducted in the late 90s at the Kaiser Permanente Health Clinic in Southern California, researchers found that 50% of the population they surveyed had experienced at least one ACE during their childhood, and 25% had experienced two or more. As the number of ACEs an individual has experienced goes up, so does their risk for impaired functioning later on in life. Trauma doesn't only have to be experienced to have a significant impact on someone. Being a witness to a traumatic event is just as harmful. That is why there's an intergenerational transmission of trauma. When parents and other guardians do not recover from their own traumatic experiences, that directly impacts the children they raise. And it doesn't have to be a severe form of abuse to have an impact. Take divorce, for example. Not all divorces involve nasty custody battles and fights. Some couples choose to part ways amicably. Even so, that's considered a trauma for the adults and children involved. I bet you never thought that your marriage could influence the quality of your children's romantic relationships or who they pick as a romantic partner, but it does. Parental divorce significantly increases the risk of negative emotional, behavioral, and health outcomes for children involved. It leads them to be less trusting of their romantic partners, higher divorce rates, and higher levels of relationship dissatisfaction. Trauma impacts witnesses and those directly related to the person who experienced it in a similar manner. The effects are devastating both ways. Now that you've heard a bit of background information explaining the importance of ACEs and the effect they have on functioning for so many people, I'll get into the details of my project. I knew that childhood trauma influences physical, emotional, and mental functioning throughout the lifespan. But when I was thinking about how I wanted to set up my project, a couple of questions popped into my head. How does childhood trauma affect the way we relate to other people? And how do these changes alter our preferences for people we choose to date and marry? For this project, I wanted to examine ACEs, but I added another component. The purpose of my project then became to identify which ACE items and which clusters of ACEs affect adult romantic relationships. To do this, I came up with 3 variables to measure adult romantic relationships. These 3 variables included current relationship status, current marital status, and number of long-term relationships, which I defined as lasting for a year or longer after the age of 16. My study was primarily exploratory, leading me to create these two broad research questions to examine. First, which ACE items have the strongest impact on marital status, number of romantic relationships, and current relationship status? And second, which cluster of ACEs has the strongest effect on adult romantic relationships? As I have mentioned, I wanted to examine individual ACE items. This slide here shows the 10 individual ACE items that are on the ACE questionnaire. A participant filling this out would indicate a yes for one of these 10 questions if they had experienced that particular ACE item. Each time an individual answers yes, it counts for 1 point. Most of the research that's out there examines the effects of an individual's total ACE score, meaning the number out of 10 that they answered yes to. I wanted this study to be different to see if any one item has a greater influence than the others. So what the heck do I mean when I say clusters of ACEs? The 10 individual ACE items can be grouped into 3 separate clusters: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. The first cluster is abuse, which contains ACE items regarding physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The second cluster is neglect, containing items addressing both physical and emotional neglect. And the final cluster is household dysfunction, containing the remaining 5 ACE items regarding mental illness, incarcerated relatives, a mother treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. Research has not yet examined this possible cluster effect in regard to ACEs. With this project, I wanted to see if one cluster had more impact on adult romantic relationships than others. To examine these research questions, I needed participants. Participants were recruited from various social media platforms, including Facebook and Instagram. In order to participate, individuals had to be at least 18 years of age. There was no age cap in this research. When my study concluded, I ended up having 93 total participants. I was thrilled with this result given that my study was only open for 4 weeks. Out of the 93 total participants, 9 were excluded from data analysis. 6 were eliminated because of the time that had elapsed from when they opened the survey link to when it closed was less than 45 seconds. This was not enough time for individuals to complete the survey in its entirety. 3 more individuals were eliminated for time elapsed that was greater than 25,000 seconds, suggesting a carelessness in electronic responsiveness. And finally, an additional participant was removed because they did not meet the age requirements set up for this study. That left me with 84 participants to use for data analysis. On average, it took participants 158 seconds, or approximately 2.6 minutes, to complete this study. Of the individuals who chose to participate, 66% identified as biologically female, 33% as biologically male, and 1% as gender neutral. The mean age for participants was 27.25 years, and participants ranged in age from 18 to 69 years old. Diving into a bit of detail about my participant demographics, regarding participant race and ethnicity, 88% of participants identified as white or Caucasian, 3.6% of participants identified as either an American Indian or Alaskan Native or the other category, and 2.4% identified as Black or African American and Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish. In regard to marital status, 67% of participants indicated that they were single, 26% identified as married, and 7% identified as divorced. There were also widowed and separated options, but I did not have any participants within my sample indicate either of those 2 options in regard to marital status. In regard to current relationship status, 36% of participants were currently single, 31% were dating someone, 26% were married, and 7% were engaged. When it came to the variable of long-term relationships, I had to provide a definition for what qualified as a long-term relationship. As I have previously mentioned, I chose to define a long-term relationship as lasting for a year or longer after the age of 16. Out of my participant population, 17% had not had a relationship of that duration. Nearly 40% of respondents indicated only one serious long-term relationship, while 26% indicated having only 2 serious long-term relationships. The remaining 17% of respondents indicated having 3 or more long-term relationships lasting a year or longer after the age of 16. As I mentioned before, participants were recruited through the use of social media. They were asked to click on the link provided in the post, which then took them directly to the survey created through Psych Data. Participants were then presented with 3 different pages to fill out within the Psych Data system. The first was an informed consent document confirming their participation in this research. The second was a demographic form where they provided information about themselves and their romantic relationships. And the third and final page was the ACE questionnaire itself. So what did I find? For my data analysis, the predictor variables were my 3 measures of adult romantic relationships: current marital status, current relationship status, and number of long-term relationships. My outcome variables were then the 10 ACE items themselves. Statistical significance was set at p less than 0.05. The first analysis that I performed was a chi-squared test of independence. This analysis was performed to answer which of the 10 ACE items has the most influence on the 3 measures of adult romantic relationships. Each of the 3 variables were measured separately with the 10 ACE items. Significance less than 0.05 was found between 2 ACE items and the variable of marital status. There was no significance found with either of the other 2 variables, current relationship status or number of long-term relationships, with any of the ACE items. Significance was found between divorced individuals and ACE item number 2 regarding physical abuse and ACE item number 4 regarding emotional neglect. So what does that mean? Divorced individuals are significantly more likely than married or single individuals to have been exposed to or subjected to physical abuse or emotional neglect in childhood. The next analysis I performed was another chi-squared test. This time, the question that came to mind was whether or not men and women differ in their experiences with ACEs. Even though this was not one of my original research questions, I wanted to see if any gender differences existed. The results of this analysis were pretty staggering. Of the 10 total ACE items, 5 of them ended up being significant for women. Women were significantly more likely than men to have been victims of or witness to emotional and physical neglect, substance abuse, mental illness, and an incarcerated relative. In addition to the 2 chi-squared analyses, I also ran ANOVAs. The first ANOVA I ran was to determine which individual ACE items had the most influence on number of long-term relationships. Significance was found on ACE items regarding sexual abuse, divorce, and substance abuse. As the number of long-term relationships someone has goes up, so do their chances of being exposed to sexual abuse, substance abuse, and divorce in some way. And finally, the last analysis that I conducted for this research study was another ANOVA. I wanted to identify which cluster of ACEs of the 3 possible clusters had the most influence on romantic relationships in adulthood. Based on the literature that I had previously read in preparation for this project, I suspected that it would be the abuse cluster because that cluster contains 3 forms of pretty severe trauma, including physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. My analysis confirmed that suspicion. The abuse cluster proved to be significant with the variable of marital status, specifically for divorced individuals. Not only are divorced individuals significantly more likely than married or single individuals to have been exposed to physical abuse, emotional neglect during childhood, as found from the chi-squared analyses, but they are also significantly more likely to have been witness to any of the 3 forms of abuse within the abuse cluster itself. After analyzing my data and reviewing the results for my project, I knew that I wanted this research to be applicable on a large scale. Through the existing literature and this study, the prevalence of ACEs is apparently clear. The effects that stem as a result of childhood trauma are life-changing. Specifically regarding physical abuse, the literature is clear. The fact that physical abuse and the abuse cluster were both identified through my research to have significance for divorced individuals directly affects romantic relationships and marriage later on in life. The long-term effects of child abuse for individuals who have experienced it are more likely to show higher levels of aggression, abuse their own children, and inflict and receive dating violence, and physically abuse their spouses. That's an extremely critical detail for mental health professionals to know when they're taking on and evaluating new clients. A study done by Rossiter in 2015 found that 63% of female adult clients had not been asked about their childhood trauma. This alarming number could be the result from low disclosure rates by the clients themselves or from clinicians not inquiring about their past experiences. If it's due to the latter of those two possibilities, this study shows that it is imperative for mental health professionals to address these issues with their patients. Specifically, this study demonstrates the importance of asking female clients about past trauma, given that they were significantly more likely to have been subjected to some form of it when compared to men. Mental health teams must do a better job inquiring about childhood trauma, documenting that trauma, and adapting their services to better help those clients with those experiences in their past. The results from this study imply that clinicians should be attending to certain ACE items or clusters, particularly if their client discloses a divorced marital status or indicates more than 4 long-term relationships as an adult. Overall, I was very pleased with the results of my study and how this research project turned out. With that said, there's always room for improvement. There were a couple possible limitations within this study. First was the timeline for this research. Data collection was only open for 1 month's time, creating a small time frame for researchers to get their desired sample size. While the response rate for that short timeline was very high, the desired sample size was not reached. A small sample size could explain the reason for not finding significant results in more of the ACE items and clusters. Opening the study up again in the future and recruiting more participants could produce a significant effect in more of the individual ACE items as well as the other 2 clusters of ACEs. The next limitation of this study was due to a low demographic minority sample. Due to the circumstances regarding COVID-19 and this study being put online, it reached mostly rural populations, creating a sample that resulted in 90% of the participants identifying as white Caucasians. There wasn't a lot of variety representing demographic minorities within this research project. The third limitation was the sample size for the divorced group within the marital status variable. That group contained only 6 individuals. That small of a sample size means that any one person within the group who had experienced an ACE made for a larger effect than any one person in the single or married groups, which contained 56 and 22 people in them respectively. This research would benefit greatly by recruiting more divorced individuals to see if the same results are true with a larger sample size for that population. The final limitation of this study was the fact that there were significantly more female than male participants in this research. That could have influenced the gender differences found within this study. Recruiting more male participants would benefit this research if it is reopened again in the future. If this study were to be reopened again in the future, the single population of individuals in this research, in regard to current marital status and current relationship status, could be further examined in order to expand upon the influences in determining their single status. Questions for consideration could dive into the reasons of why those individuals are still single. Are they delaying marriage and committed relationships because of their negative childhood experiences? Or is it from the instability of their family model and dynamic growing up that decreases their willingness and inclination to enter into committed long-term relationships? Or could they simply be more cautious and want to spend longer amounts of time dating someone in a committed relationship before fully committing to them in marriage or otherwise, so they feel more confident in their decision of a romantic partner? This idea of expansion could add additional dimensions to measuring adult romantic relationships in this research. Another avenue for expansion for this study could be sexual orientation. Adding that variable in could identify any differences in ACE responses, specifically whether there are alternative responses in individuals who identify as homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, or asexual. Sexual orientation could display significant differences in the experiences of ACE items as well as ACE clusters. This would be a good way to expand and diversify the demographics of this research. Going forward, I would be excited for the opportunity to open this research up again to recruit more participants and see what the results show. In conclusion, I would like to say thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my Honors Capstone Defense. It means so much to me to have your support. I want to extend a special thank you to Dr. Amelia Flint for her knowledgeable guidance, support, and help during this year of research. It would not have been possible for me to get this study created, completed, or finalized without her guidance. I also want to extend a thank you to my Honors Capstone Committee of Dr. Alyssa Call and Dr. Michael Huxford. Thank you so much for your feedback and support throughout the length of this project. Once again, thank you to everyone who took the time to listen. I hope you enjoyed it.